everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Mission Log. My name is Jason Gilbert. I am a fellow Trekkie, and I want to thank you for joining me in this journey as I review every Star Trek mission from the beginning. I wonder, would you consider subscribing to this channel? It would really help me out. Now today, we're going to be looking at Season 1, Episode 2, titled Charlie X. This episode guest starred Robert Walker Jr. as Charlie. It was released on September the 15th, 1966. The writer of the story is Gene Roddenberry. The teleplay is written by D.C. Fontana. The episode is directed by Lawrence Dobkin and is produced by Gene Roddenberry. Let's dive into the story. The episode begins with a captain's log, stardate 1533.6. The Enterprise is coming alongside a vessel called the Antares. Its captain and first officer beam aboard with a 17-year-old named Charlie Evans. Something is up, however, as the captain and first officer have concerned looks on their faces. We see Charlie making a very weird face, and then their facial expressions change as they start boasting how incredible Charlie is. We discover right off the bat that Charlie has manipulative powers, and he lived alone on planet Thesis since he was 3 years old. Charlie is amazed when he learns that there are 428 people aboard the Enterprise. The Enterprise is headed for a place called Colony 5, where Charlie has some relatives. Yeoman Rand walks in, and Charlie is infatuated by her beauty. This is the first girl he has ever seen. Kirk orders Rand to take Charlie to his quarters. We then fade into the title sequence. We then see Charlie undergoing a physical examination by Dr. McCoy. He's been alone since he was 3 years old. He learned to talk with ship's tapes and memory banks, and he's very awkward with everyone. He asks McCoy if he likes him, and he conveys that on the other ship the crew didn't like him. Next, we see Charlie walking around the ship and observing the crew and their duties, and then he encounters Rand in the corridor, and he begins to follow her. Out of nowhere, he offers her what I presume to be perfume, and she indicates that it's her favorite and asks how he got it since the ship's stores don't have it. His reply was, "It's a present." Now, she had to attend to her duties, but she invited Charlie to join her in the recreation room after her shift. And as she walks away, he slaps her playfully on her rear end. Now, she calls him out on his very inappropriate behavior. And then after forgiving him, she tells him to talk to the captain about why it was wrong. Now, on the bridge, Kirk asks McCoy to help Charlie in adolescent things, and McCoy is hesitant. Spock talks about the planet Thasia, and Kirk asks if he believes that legend. And Spock said that on that planet, some form of life was there to nurture Charlie. This is also the very, very first time we see Spock and McCoy argue and debate with each other, and be looking for that often throughout this series. In Recreation Room 6, we see Spock playing a harp-like instrument. Uhura is singing, and Spock is irritated by the interruption. However, he smiles and he begins playing, and she improvises a flirtatious song about Spock. Charlie walks in, and when the song is finished, Rand wants her to do one more song, and so she begins to improvise one about Charlie. He doesn't like it, and so he uses his powers to silence her. He then proceeds to try to impress Rand by showing her some very impressive card tricks, when in actuality he's using his powers to make the pictures of her appear on the cards, and then he makes one of the cards appear under her shirt. Next, we see Kirk talking to the galley chief about Thanksgiving dinner for the crew and orders that the meatloaf be made to look like turkeys. When Charlie runs in to speak to him about the earlier incident with Rand, Kirk struggled to come up with a good answer, and then he is summoned to the bridge. And as he and Charlie get into the turbo lift, Kirk clearly has his uniform shirt on. When they reach the bridge, however, Kirk has a different shirt on. Maybe he changed en route, but he is wearing something completely different. Now, over the speakers, the Antares is trying to communicate with the Enterprise, a distress signal. All of a sudden, communications are cut off and Spock picks up debris on his scanners. The Antares has been completely destroyed. Just then, the galley chief calls the bridge to inform Kirk that the meatloaf in the ovens has been turned into real turkeys. Charlie laughs, then leaves the bridge. Kirk is having a game of 3D chess with Spock as they discuss the destruction of the Antares. Spock mentions that he believes that Charlie is responsible for it as he knew what happened to the ship before the rest of them did. It's at that moment Charlie walks in. Kirk defeats Spock with a checkmate. Kirk leaves them to have a game of chess, and Spock tries to explain the game, but Charlie said, "Let's just play." Spock beats him in 3 moves, and after he leaves, Charlie melts the white pieces with his power. Now, out in the corridor, Charlie runs into Rand and a young lady, and she wanted to introduce Charlie to someone his own age. He has absolutely zero interest, and Rand reprimands him for being rude. In his own unique way, right there in the corridor, he proclaims his love for her. She then proceeds to take the matter up with Captain Kirk. Now, Kirk tries to have a conversation with him about how his feelings for Rand are inappropriate because of the age difference. Now, Charlie looks up to Kirk. Kirk takes him to the fitness center where he's trying to teach him how to fight. And in a sparring match with Kirk, a crewman laughs. In anger, Charlie makes him disappear. Kirk is both stunned and angry, and Kirk has 2 security officers try to escort Charlie to his quarters, but he fights them off with his mind. When one pulls a phaser on him, Charlie makes every phaser on the ship disappear. Finally, he agrees to go with them. In a conversation with Spock and McCoy, Spock says that according to legend, the Thasians have had the power to transmutate matter, and surmises that they passed that power on to Charlie. Spock says that he has no doubt in his mind that Charlie destroyed the Antares. McCoy suggests that Kirk be the one to deal with him because Charlie respects him as an authority figure. Charlie walks in and Kirk asks him directly if he destroyed the Antares. He said yes, because they weren't nice to him. And then Kirk asked him what he would do with them, and he said he didn't know, and left. Kirk wants to speak with Colony 5, and Uhura's controls go haywire, injuring her. Helm is not responding either. Spock is also being manipulated by Charlie into saying silly rhymes. Now, as Charlie leaves, he encounters the young lady that Rand tried to introduce him to earlier, and he turns her into a lizard. He barges into Rand's quarters. She secretly hits a switch, and the bridge can hear the encounter. Kirk and Spock race to her quarters, and he forces them away with his powers, breaking Spock's legs and injuring Kirk. Rand slaps him across the face, and he makes her disappear. He tells Kirk that he needs Kirk to operate the ship. Kirk said that he needs Spock to help him operate it, and so finally he restores Spock's legs and releases the power on them. Kirk and Spock try to trick him by putting him behind a force field, but he simply makes it disappear. Charlie then runs off and wreaks havoc on the ship by making a young lady turn old and by making another young lady's face disappear. Kirk surmises that Charlie is using the limits of his power to control the ship. He comes up with a plan to turn on all ship's controls in order to tax Charlie's power enough for Kirk to distract him so that McCoy can tranquilize him. They carry out Kirk's plan, and it seems to be working. All of a sudden, a message comes in from the Thasians. Rand all of a sudden reappears. A glowing, transparent vessel appears on the screen. A Thasian hologram appears on the bridge. Charlie learns the lesson that abusing great power has consequences. The Thasians intervened, returned control of the ship to Kirk, and reversed everything that Charlie did. Now, even with all of the mishaps and the havoc that Charlie wreaked on the ship, out of compassion, Kirk fights on his behalf. He tells the Thasians that Charlie belongs with his own people. But he is told that the powers given to Charlie are irreversible and that he would never have the strength to resist using them for bad purposes. They offer Charlie life and they promise to take care of him. And in a very emotional moment, Charlie disappears, leaving the bridge crew saddened that Charlie will live his whole life away from humans, and the ship goes off to its next mission. Charlie X is a very interesting story. It is essentially a story of an awkward teen who has never known a true human relationship, given incredible powers, but does not know how to govern them. Now, this would have been an incredibly tough situation for an actor, and kudos to young Robert Walker Jr., who acted this very, very well. That being said, I am going to be a little bit tough on this episode, okay? The story itself was solid, mixing legend with reality. I wish that the Thasians could have been explored in more detail, but definitely time constraints would have hindered that. Kirk, who is a remarkable ship's captain, had to be a father figure to a very hard-to-handle teen who knew nothing of real life. And I have to admit that Shatner acted this incredibly. He was a great actor. Also, Leonard Nimoy was incredible as Spock, and the part where Charlie had him reciting rhymes against his will was just incredible acting. Also, the very first debate between Spock and McCoy. It's the first of many, and I love them. It's the stuff of legends. And now to the elements that I didn't like. Firstly, the horrible editing job regarding Kirk's wardrobe malfunction. It stood out like a sore thumb. I felt that the scene in the recreation room was long and dragged out. I loved how Spock was irritated when Uhura was interrupting his playing, but then he immediately became amused and smiled as he played and sang. To me, it felt out of place, and it was just put there to fill in time on the screen. Personally, I feel that this could have been time spent learning more about the Thasians. I also did not like the butt slap. Very, very inappropriate. I think in reality, Rand would have been way more upset than she actually was on the episode and not so quick to forgive. In fact, I even felt that she led him on a little instead of discouraging his behavior, inviting him to join her in the rec room and that sort of thing. And she was amazed and amused at his magic tricks. I didn't like the way Charlie used his powers with his eyes rolling up to into his head, but it was effective nonetheless. One other thing I will mention that I didn't like was the absence of key characters. This is the second episode in a row now where Engineer Scott was not present. Sulu was nowhere to be found, and it would have been nice to see him at least at the helm. And we have yet to meet Pavel Chekhov. Now, in my opinion, the negative elements outweigh the positive here, and so I give Charlie X 2 out of 5 Starfleet insignias for awesomeness. Well, I hope I didn't create too many enemies with this review. Please feel free to leave a comment. All I ask is that we treat each other with respect and that we keep the comments profanity free. I want to thank you for watching this review. I hope it was an enjoyable experience for you. Please join me again when I review a classic episode, The Naked Time. Also, please, once again, consider subscribing to this channel. I would really appreciate it. Until we meet again, live long and prosper.